What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys, and I know I say that each week, but this time I'm a little bit extra excited. Those of you guys that watched Nick's video that he posted yesterday on the running back trade targets know exactly why I'm excited, and I know it sounds a little bit silly to those of you that aren't making these videos each week, but the reason I'm pumped over this vid is because we are switching up the format a little bit. As mentioned, it is going to be going over the trade targets, Nick posting running backs yesterday, me wide receivers today. And those of you that do follow fantasy football content creators during the off season, you're well aware that we do lose a bit of creative liberty when we hit this part of the season, much different than the summer months where we're able to make a video on basically anything we want. As for exactly what changes we're implementing in this video, we're just basically going to be going over a bit more of the strategy portion as opposed to just the direct players, to more surround what your current record is, what you may need to do to change your mindset in order to ensure you make it to the playoffs, and which players you can target in order to help you do so. If you're not though, we still will have all the trade targets you could possibly ask for. They'll just be tailored more to your specific situation, which could end up helping you even more. Before we do get into the video though, just a shout out and reminder that switching up this video did take me quite a long time yesterday. While I was pumped and the time did fly by, if you do enjoy it, I'd really appreciate if you could just hit that like button. It will let us know that we can continue to make or develop this type of idea moving forward. And hey, if you do actually like the old format better, or maybe want to incorporate a mix of the both, give us your ideas in the comment section down below. You know we always listen to you guys, always trying to improve. And for those of you out there that may be newer to hearing our videos, maybe you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe. But with all of that out of the way, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was just Jamar Chase and Randy Moss currently lead the league in fantasy points scored in a PPR format through the first 6 games of their NFL career. Your question was which player ranked third just behind them. The correct answer was Anquan Bolden, a player who had a phenomenal start to his career. But as for today's stat of the day, we're keeping it simple for this one, and it's going to be which running back currently leads the league in the area of rushing percentage over expectation. To be clear, this is not rushing yards over expectation. This is more to do with the rate at which they ran. The player we're looking for in this one has absolutely no minimum, so once again, that's going to be which running back currently leads the league in the area of rushing percentage over expectation. If you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all that out of the way though, it's time to hop right into it. So I know some of you out there don't know exactly where we're headed with this video, so I feel like a great place to start is to kind of give you an overview, and then we'll hit it piece by piece. First of all, I just want to summarize and let you know the reason that we're doing this is because we're now 7 weeks into the season, and even with us getting an extra week of NFL content, an extra week of fantasy football, we are now at the point of the season that you could consider the point of no return. That means those teams that may be starting off very slow, maybe you dealt with some early injuries or drafted an injured player like Michael Thomas, invested into Christian McCaffrey. I know nobody that drafted him is doing all that well. I know many teams that are starting off 2-4, 1-5, even 0-6 at times, and not to any fault of their own. But on the flip side of that, we also do have a significant portion of the percentage that may have started off completely red hot. As we know, with each action comes an equal and opposite reaction, and those teams that did suffer an injury to their roster, their opponents, they did get an easier matchup. So while some people did get off to a slow start, other people are red hot and maybe undefeated at this point. The reason we're bringing that up though is because whether you're 1-5 or 5-1, many people think that's not going to change your overall strategy in the players you target in trades. Obviously, we all want to get good players on our roster. That's the ultimate goal, but we're here to tell you that there is a strategy that you can use, whether you're a steady Eddie, had some early season luck, or maybe your team's down in the dumps. We promise each and every one of you that even though we're heading into week 7, those teams that don't have a single win right now can still make the playoffs with a little bit of luck as well as a lot of right moves. The first step in even being able to head in that direction is to know where you stand when it comes to the playoff brackets and projected playoff standings. It is possible that somebody that is 0-6 right now has already been eliminated, but it's also possible somebody 1-5 or 0-6 is just a mere 2 or 3 games behind. That's why we hope now heading into week 7 that each person listening to this video can just take one bit of advice from us, and that's just to be self-aware. You'd be surprised. You may think you have a comfortable lead sitting at 4-3, but you may be right in the mix of things. So being self-aware is going to help you make those correct decisions, knowing if you should tighten it up, maybe spend a little bit of extra time on the waiver wire next week, or that may be the difference between you accepting that trade that you were a bit on the fence about or completely declining it. And up on your screen, I do have an example of a league that I'm in. It's actually a 10-team PPR league in ESPN. In this one, I'm doing quite good, sitting at 4-2. I'm not going to say that I'm top 3 or anything, but I know I have a strong roster. I know where I stand versus my opponents. I know how many teams are going to be getting into the playoffs, how many weeks in total we actually have before the playoffs start, and I know that's a question we wouldn't have in other years, but with us now extending the season by 1 week, I found myself asking just yesterday if we started in week 14 or 15, so I was guilty of it myself, knowing if you had that extra week or if it's going to be much like it was last season. Once again, that's a factor that's going to impact some of your decisions. Spoiler alert for those of you that are actually wondering that same answer, it's going to depend on your platform. For ESPN, the playoffs do start in week 15, or at least in the only ESPN league I'm in. So if any of you else out there are in an ESPN league as well, I'm not going to say that this is going to be one size fits all, so be sure to check it for your side as well. So now that we have a few pieces of vital information, including my current record, how many weeks we have remaining left in the season until the playoffs start, the next important factor is, of course, how many teams in total do make it into the playoffs. You can then bounce your record up against your opponents, know how much of either a lead you have or how far you are behind, and give yourself a good idea on if you need to catch up or maybe even pick up the pace. I know we're 9 weeks away from most playoffs starting, but this is the time to get ahead of it. Having an understanding of this is going to make sure you're proactive with every decision and in this specific league that you're looking for right out front of you. My final determination was that I only need about 6 wins or less in order to make sure I squeak into the playoffs. As we get a bit closer to that actual date, I'll do another calculation to find out what it will take to get a bye week. Then I'll know if maybe I put in a bit more effort, I can lock in that bye week, guaranteeing at a minimum I at least make it out of that first round. I did also want to take a look at a sleeper league of mine, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what it looks like over there. Those of you familiar with this platform, this is going to look just like you see each and every day logging into the platform. For those of you that don't know exactly where this screen is defined, this is going to be on the mobile version. It's going to be under the League tab as soon as you actually hit the specific league you're in. When you get to the League tab, it's going to show this week's matchups, but you're going to have to scroll down a bit further than that. If you think you've made it there but don't see it, continue to scroll down even further and eventually you'll get to this section. And I know what you see on the far right is a bit intimidating, and the reason that is because this is a whopping 16-team league that I'm in with Nick, also a ton of our other subscribers. It's an absolutely fun league. Unfortunately for me though, I'm not really doing the best in it. But on the flip side, looking at the glass half full, at least this is not only a perfect example, but starting early in week 7, I'll have plenty of opportunity to try to turn this thing around, and I'll let you know exactly how my decisions when it comes to targeting players, how that's going to be impacted by my record, and stay tuned for that. I think you guys will really like that part, but just to kind of reiterate on what I went over for ESPN, I asked myself the same questions. What's my current record? Sitting at 2-4. I mean, only 2 games behind what I was performing like in the ESPN league where I was nearly atop the leaderboard. As for the questions that I asked myself, it starts with what's my current record? We mentioned that 2-4, but behind that it says how many weeks are remaining. The answer to that is also 9. Then when it comes to how many players make it into the playoffs, I wrote down 6 here, but with it being a 16-team league, I'm more on the side of 8. I've heard of 10, considering there is 16 total, but let's meet in the middle and assume that there's going to be 8 players making it into the playoffs. And unlike ESPN, this is what makes this example a bit more interesting, is we do have to calculate the difference in our spot, meaning my current ranking, which I mentioned was 14th, how far away I am from 8th from that, and the answer to that is actually 6 spots. So let's compare how I am looking at when it comes to my record versus the player who's 6 spots ahead of me. Believe it or not, in this league, although I'm 2-4, it looks like the player that's currently ranking in the 8th position is sitting at just 1 game ahead of me, coming in at 3-3. And even if our worst nightmares were true and only 6 players were able to make it into the playoffs, it appears that the player that's currently ranked in 6th, he's sitting at 3-3 as well. And this is yet again another good example of how sometimes we can look at our records, see how many opponents we have in the field, and looking at ourselves being 2-4, then seeing that I'm ranked 14th in the league. I think many people out there like myself would just be absolutely nervous of how I was going to handle this moving forward. Now that I know I'm only 1 game behind and in 2 weeks I could be completely in a different situation, I'm not going to stress as much. Maybe I'm not going to accept a deal that's going to hurt me in the long run just to try to squeak out a win right now, because I know that I shouldn't be panicking. And as promised, I did want to go over how your record could impact some of your decisions that you make and how you could use that to your advantage. A good place to start with that is definitely going to be in classifying the types of situations you could be in. We of course have league managers that are sitting undefeated. They've likely avoided injuries. Maybe they got lucky taking a player off the waiver wire, drafted Cordero Patterson. There could be a million factors, including dumb luck, that led them to this point, but one thing is for sure, when it comes to their odds of making the playoffs in this league, it's going to be pretty high. They're going to have to botch it pretty bad from this point forward in order to miss the playoffs. So when it comes to keeping their options open, it would be foolish of them not to. That means they can take trades that they otherwise wouldn't if they needed a win right now, meaning players like Christian McCaffrey, someone who is projected to return in 2 weeks but may not come back for several weeks after that. This would be a player that somebody in a desperate situation would likely not be able to target. Players that are ranking first or second in their league with absolutely low urgency, they don't have to give it even a second thought. We'll go from one extreme to another though, and look at those players that have extremely high urgency. Once again, we go back to the 16-team league. Now, when it comes to that yellow bar that you're currently seeing, I have that circling a player who would be in a situation with high urgency. Currently, if you look hard enough, you can see that their record stands at 1-5. The reason this sleeper example looks slightly different though is because this one does have 2 divisions. And when it comes to 2 divisions, that means that due to sheer luck, you could be in either a tough one or a difficult one, just like the NFL. So you could have 2 players with an identical record, both sitting at 1-5, both sitting in separate divisions. But one player, due to luck, could be just 1 game behind their opponents, 1 game out of the playoffs. Meanwhile, the other one, due to the players that are in their division having better drafts or stronger starts to the season, that player may be 3 games behind already. And I know it sounds unfair. It's one reason why I don't prefer 2 division leagues. That's why the 2 examples I showed you earlier, leagues of my own, neither of them did have multiple divisions, but this is something that many of you out there are currently dealing with and something you should be prepared for when you do this research process. Circling back to this specific example we show up on the screen, this is a player, as mentioned, that does have a high urgency to produce immediately. With him sitting at 1-5 and knowing that the top 8 teams, 4 from each division, are the only ones that are going to make it into the playoffs, that does mean he does have to make it top 4 in his own division. And currently looking at the player that's in 4th place, unfortunately for him, that player is sitting at 4-2. That's 3 games ahead of him already. Had he by sheer luck been placed in the other division, he would have had a much better chance to make it to the playoffs, but we're still not going to rule him out at this point. However, him having this type of knowledge, knowing he's already 3 games behind, this would alter how I would handle things moving forward, the types of players that I'm targeting. Stay tuned for more specific examples in each category, but before we do that, we do want to touch on the medium urgency. This is going to be the players that are either right in the middle of the pack, maybe you have a similar amount of wins and losses, maybe you're even down a game or 2 or up a game or 2, but with a stroke of luck or a stroke of bad luck, that could alter where you're ranked. So a player with this type of urgency doesn't have to take their foot off the gas or kick it into high gear. All they have to do is just keep making sound decisions, as they have been presumably doing up to this point already. But now that we've gone over all of that, let's touch on more specific examples. I just want to highlight what types of players we're looking for so you can start to notice a trend when I go over the players that we have listed in a specific category. Knowing this information will even help you when you take a look at your record, see where you stand, and looking at the players that have low urgency. Once again, these are going to be the players that have a sizable lead. They don't care if they take a couple losses, they're looking towards the playoffs. And smart players that are in this type of situation will take full advantage of that. And some of you may think you're taking full advantage by maybe kicking your feet up, not scouring the waiver wire, adding and dropping players frivolously, spending your fab. But no, there's other ways you can go about it a bit smarter, and that's by targeting players that are either coming back from injury, maybe even targeting those higher risk players. So sacrificing wins right now, maybe targeting a player like C-Mac, as we had mentioned earlier. Michael Thomas, another player of note that somebody in this situation should certainly be throwing offers out for. Not many teams in the league that own Michael Thomas have the luxury of just being able to have him sit on the bench. They could much greater use a player that has lower upside when it comes to what production you could expect down the road. Because who knows, they might be that player that's 3 games behind already in a tough division. And the best part about it is that you can go into your specific league, look in the same screen that you use to identify where you stand versus your opponents, and identify which players have the most to lose, which players are a bit more desperate. Knowing that information up front, it's going to give you a ton of leverage in trades. Just be sure you handle those situations with class. You don't want to burn any bridges. There's still 9 weeks until we actually hit the playoffs. Then looking at those players that do have the high urgency, those league managers, the types of players that they may want to prioritize, those are going to be players that do have immediate production, but maybe at the expense of their long-term future. These type of owners may value a high floor because the reason that they got in this situation and dealt with some early losses, while we don't know for certain, it's likely because some of their players busted, meaning they're likely to value a floor a bit more than somebody who has been hitting their ceiling each and every week would. With them also knowing that they do have to step it up from this point forward, they are going to value guaranteed production, so players with a higher floor, a lower ceiling, players like maybe Mike Davis at the running back position, Jacoby Myers at wide receiver, players that we're not going to be looking to start against some of those higher upside teams, but players that we certainly know will put them in, and they haven't really scored under double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues at all. Those players are going to be much more valuable to a player that has this high urgency versus a player with low urgency. And if, let's say, you are the person that is in a tight bind and you need some wins right now, you're the player that does have a high urgency to produce right now, some of the best targets you could possibly go after are those injured players that are going to be temporary stopgaps for offenses. Damian Williams, Chuba Hubbard, Devontae Booker. There are just so many names of players that are going to cost you next to nothing. Nobody can realistically ask for an RB1 for a player that they know isn't even going to be starting in 2 weeks, and the production you might get out of that player for those next 2 weeks might be RB1 production, and that could be exactly what you need over that span. Meanwhile, these players are just trying to liquidate them at the earliest possible opportunity, because if they hold them any longer, they're unlikely to get absolutely anything for that player. So it sounds like a win-win on both sides, but this could be something that you actually try and attack, something you go after as opposed to wait for it to fall in your lap. So those of you in these desperate situations, don't feel like you have no options. You just kind of have to change your mindset in the players you go to target. Then lastly, the most boring of the classes, we have that medium player. They're either tied or up or down a couple. What they're looking for is players that could be and fall on both sides, but consistent producers. The good thing about people in this situation is that they can play both sides of the fence, targeting those players with those short-term rentals, also the players that do have those high ceilings that may not be able to produce for several weeks. Balancing out a roster that combines both of those is going to be one way that you can also have. Balancing out your roster in this way is Balancing out your roster exactly like that is a way you can have your cake and eat it too. But now time to go over to the specific examples, and we're going back to the fun stuff. We're talking about those high risk players, those players that may need production right away. And these are a list of wide receivers that I feel would be very beneficial to anyone in that situation that either needs early production. Maybe you've dealt with early injuries, so your starting lineup's not as strong as somebody who just was handed wins in the early weeks, so you might not have a bunch of excess money to go and throw away for new players. So some of these players, you'll notice they are much cheaper than you'll find in any of the other categories. But to start this list, Emmanuel Sanders, he's currently a top 24 wide receiver. While I understand he's not going to come cheap, I don't think many people out there that own Emmanuel Sanders are going to be asking for a top 24 price tag. And when you go to make trades for Emmanuel Sanders, the types of owners that likely have him are people that aren't going to appreciate him because he's been producing like that for the entire season. They invested a very low draft pick into him, so some people, they don't know exactly what they have. And while I'm not saying that is you if you own Emmanuel Sanders or your league mate standing next to you, I do know I have been offered Emmanuel Sanders for very cheap prices, and his long-term sustainability may not be as high as the production he's producing right now. But if you need some points or to target a player that you're going to get at less than retail, but also don't discount AJ Green. He's an aging wide receiver, a player who's only received 6 targets as a high, and that does scare a lot of owners, but each and every week he goes out there and he produces. And one common theme for players in this situation is that unfortunately their players up to this point just have not been producing. So getting a player that's only getting 6 targets, I could care less as long as he's getting the job done. And up to this point, AJ Green has been doing that. He's going to cost you next to nothing, and he's currently a top 30 wide receiver. There's no way in heck you're going to have to pay half that. You'll probably have to pay maybe a flex type value for him, and there is a chance that he continues this up for several weeks. Just keep in mind he is older, the risk is higher, but again, those are exactly the type of players we're targeting. Next, we have Courtland Sutton, and the reason he's on this list is because his value in the short to long term is going to drop off with Jerry Jeudy returning. For that, a lot of owners are going to look to liquidate him for pennies on the dollar. While he's not going to be cheap, he has been producing as a top 20 wide receiver. Some owners who just have been sitting pretty, they may give him up for a top 35 price tag, and there's a chance that even when Jerry Jeudy returns, Courtland Sutton can produce better than that, so you might get a steal right off the bat. And this is a player that you might be able to start in your playoffs because he still has a ton of weekly upside as well. Behind him, Laviska Shenault, an underperformer, a consistent producer, and he has a consistent role in his offense. A lot of people, though, do discredit him because he isn't popping off for 20-plus fantasy points. We don't see that out of this player. And you'll notice that same common theme with the remaining three, Michael Pittman, especially Jacoby Myers. So you'll notice a common theme with them. These are players that your opponents, if they are already on their track to getting into the playoffs, these aren't players that they want in their starting lineup. I know me and my stronger teams, if I'm starting Michael Pittman, I'm looking to trade up for a higher upside receiver because I know that if I do make it to the championship game, Michael Pittman in my wide receiver 2 spot just isn't going to cut it. Moving into the less fun players, these are going to be just the players that we think you all should be either buying low on or just simply buying. These are going to be for all of you out there, whether you have a risky team or a high floor team. Look to target Calvin Ridley, a player who's been underperforming all season. But at this point, I'm not really holding my breath for him to break out as he did last season. So if you do buy Calvin Ridley, just know you're likely going to be able to get the same production that you have been expecting so far this season. Just alter your expectations. You won't be disappointed with him. But in order for you not to have disappointment, that means you can't be overpaying for him. Make sure the owner, when selling him, understands that you don't believe he's going to break out. We're 7 weeks into the season. A breakout realistically would have happened already, and I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but already seen Kyle Pitts break out. Russell Gage is now coming back. The odds are stacked against him, but hopefully that just makes him cheaper. Mike Evans, this is a player that's a bit hit or miss, but a player that you can get for a deal. I would say the same thing for the player below him, Chase Claypool. One thing that these two players have in common is their phenomenal schedule in the fantasy playoffs, which is one of the main motivators for me adding him to this list. And Mike Evans, he does have a good playoff schedule as well. You know, if he does, that means Chris Godwin does, and he's coming off of his worst game of the season, I believe. The only difference between Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, though, is that you're going to be getting a higher floor with Chris Godwin, so if that's something you value, maybe that's the player you target. Now's the time to target both of those players, though. But looking at DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, these are two players on the cusp of wide receiver 1 production, both coming off of downswings. Regardless, they have several great matchups to close out the year. In addition to that, Terry McLaurin, he does potentially have Ryan Fitzpatrick returning, which could bring a ton of upside to this offense. But one thing you'll notice with each and every one of these players is that when you compare what price you'll have to pay for them today versus what likely their rest of season value is going to be, each one of these players you're more than likely going to be getting a discount on if you were to buy them today. Alright guys, moving into the final category. This is my most interesting category because this is for you players that are already set up. Maybe in your mind, you just need one higher upside player. You've looked at all your opponent's rosters. You can't see anyone that beats you. You're just avoiding injuries, trying to trade your excess depth for a player that gives you slightly more upside because you know if you're matched up against any of your league mates, the odds are going to be stacked heavily in your favor. Those are the types of teams that I absolutely love owning, but it's not every season that this early into the year we have that available to us, which is why looking at the list, it's pretty extensive. You'll have a lot of options to choose from. But if somebody were to hand you a piece of paper with all these names listed on it, I think you would just get a giggle out of it because they all have a common theme, and I think a lot of people who are in that desperate situation can thank a lot of these players for that, but their loss is your gain. And starting at the top left, we have DK Metcalf. As we know, Russell Wilson, he is injured. He has finger surgery. He may not be back for several weeks, but as long as we have him in the fantasy playoffs, then we're completely fine with having DK Metcalf in our starting lineup. I don't think we would feel as comfortable if Geno Smith was starting. However, with Geno Smith starting, it's not as if DK Metcalf completely busted, so for you teams that do have strong production already out of your starters, DK Metcalf could be a matchup-based starter for you. A player you won't be trading for and starting right away is Michael Thomas. We have absolutely no news when he's going to return. It's all speculation at this point. Maybe week 9 they're saying, but that's not a guarantee. Trading for him certainly has the opportunity to pay off. He has one of the better playoff schedules. I just have some concerns because the owner of him is going to ask for a fortune. There's no guaranteeing when he comes back he will be nearly as productive as the price you pay for him. So I think even if you are sitting in a good position, I'd rather invest my money into more of a guaranteed prospect. Speaking of guaranteed prospects, these players are certainly disappointments on the year, but I think we're starting to see improvement out of their quarterback. Darnell Mooney and Allen Robinson are the players we're speaking on, and Justin Fields, he has been producing to the best of his ability, the best we've seen him so far this year. It's not quite good enough to support wide receiver 1 production, but I guarantee you the owners of both of these players, they're not undefeated. I would be willing to bet they have 2 or more losses as well. So maybe they're in a completely different situation than you. Maybe they need that early production right now, so you could get them even cheaper than that. A player that's going to be probably the cheapest on this list though, Kadarius Toney. He's currently injured. The Giants receivers, they're beginning to get healthy. We did see the talent though sneak its way out onto the field, and that's what makes me want to invest in him. I don't care if he produces now or in 5 weeks from now. I can take him, put him on my bench, wait for him to develop, and with his price being so low, you don't lose anything by doing it. The next two, T. Higgins and Devonta Smith, these are 2 players that I'm not 100% bullish on the rest of season value. They both do have potential things that could block them from reaching their production we saw from them earlier in the season. Competition for targets for T. Higgins, upside in the offense for Devonta Smith. But if you're looking for an upside play at a discount value, those are 2 you could look to. We already discussed Chris Godwin, Amari Cooper, but Jerry Jeudy's not somebody we discussed in depth. We did talk about Courtland Sutton, mentioning Jerry Jeudy would return. And if you were to invest in Jerry Jeudy right now, the owner of him, somebody who lost, a receiver that they drafted to be their wide receiver too, it's likely that move held back their team, so they may be interested in trading him away, but with them waiting so long, if they were the original owner, now may not be the time to get him at an extreme discount. But as mentioned, if they just desperately need a win, maybe you can exploit that to your advantage. However, I wouldn't overpay for him. Courtland Sutton looks great. I think they'll be closer to a 1A, 1B than looking like Jerry Jeudy has over the past 2 seasons, so be aware of that. But moving into the next 4 players, actually I'll say next 3, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Deebo Samuel. This is the stage of the suggested players where you're not getting them at a discount, but the reason you're targeting these players is because you have proven to be one of the better teams. You do have excess when it comes to talent. Maybe you can trade away some of those players to upgrade your top wide receivers, turning any of your wide receivers into Devontae Adams, even Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill, of course. These are going to be players that instill fear in your opponents during the fantasy playoffs, so if you can trade for any of them, it's likely going to have a positive result. And the final player, maybe he doesn't fit in. I probably should have ended it with those 3 receivers, but I think Robert Woods is somebody you definitely should give a second look to. No, he hasn't produced to the high end. He did have 1 game, but for the remainder, he's only had 1 game under double-digit fantasy points. Regardless, his owners, they're frustrated, they're disappointed. You're unlikely going to have to pay up to get him, and if you can get him for a top 30 price tag and he returns to his top 15 value, you'll be doing yourself a favor, you'll be doing your league mate a favor, everybody wins. But guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video. As mentioned, if you like this, be sure to like it so we know we can create more in the future. If you're new to the channel though, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.